He built an empire without love, until a rainy night, 3 starving boys, and a single choice shattered his world and uncovered a truth that would change his legacy forever. Before we get started, leave a comment below and let us know where you're watching from so we can say hello to you. Now, on to the story. Rain slammed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Grant Whitmore's 52nd floor corner office like the world itself was trying to get in. The Manhattan skyline, usually crisp and golden at dusk, was now a blur of steel and storm, fractured by streaks of lightning that illuminated the glass towers around him. Grant stood motionless, his arms crossed, his tailored navy suit flawless as ever, yet a tension rippled beneath the surface. He wasn't a man easily shaken. Not by hostile takeovers. Not by billion-dollar decisions. Not by storms. But tonight was different. The office, sleek and silent, smelled faintly of leather, oak, and the espresso he never touched. He'd built this empire from nothing. Whitmore Holdings wasn't just a name on the building. It was his legacy, carved from 20-hour days and ruthless precision. At 44, Grant was the kind of man Forbes put on their cover and competitors feared in the boardroom. But beneath that reputation, beneath the weight of success, was a man fighting a battle no one else could see. His assistant had left hours ago, but not before dropping a stack of financial reports on his immaculate desk. Grant hadn't looked at them. His mind was still in the conference room, replaying every word from this morning's board meeting, especially Claire Caldwell's. His former business partner, once his closest ally, had turned into his most dangerous threat. Her voice had been cool, deliberate, when she questioned his judgment in front of the board, subtly planting seeds of doubt. "You've lost your edge, Grant," she'd said, all faux concern and venom wrapped in elegance. "Maybe it's time for someone else to take the wheel." He hadn't replied. Not then. Not when every instinct screamed to lash back. He'd built too much, too carefully, to let ego make decisions. A flash of lightning lit the sky again, and Grant turned away from the windows with a sigh, heading for the elevator. His driver, Thomas, had texted, "Car's ready whenever you are, sir. Weather's getting worse." Grant replied with a simple, "Give me 5." The moment the elevator doors slid open to the lobby, the scent of rain, asphalt, and urgency filled the air. Outside, Manhattan's financial district gleamed wet and cold beneath the storm. The sidewalks, awash with reflections, shimmered like broken glass. Grant stepped out under the building's awning, tugging his coat tighter against the wind. Thomas had parked across the street, the sleek black Mercedes purring like a beast in the rain. As Grant moved to cross, a flicker of movement caught his eye. There, across the street, in the shadow of a shuttered corner deli, 3 small figures huddled together under the building's overhang. They were soaked, shivering, too small to be alone. Boys, all of them. Maybe 6 or 7 years old. Identical. Grant froze. They were crouched together on the concrete, one of them holding out a paper cup to passing strangers. Most people passed faster. No one looked. No one wanted to. The boy holding the cup turned his face slightly toward the streetlight, and that's when Grant saw it. The hollow cheeks. The bruised jaw. The quiet dignity of someone used to being ignored. He looked away. Not your problem. He had a company to save. A partner to neutralize. A legacy to protect. But his feet didn't move. His chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with weather or rivalry. Why tonight? Why now? The wind howled louder, as if the city itself demanded an answer. Somewhere deep inside him, something shifted. Something he'd buried long ago under mergers, meetings, and the pursuit of control. And against every instinct that had ever made him who he was, Grant Whitmore stepped off the curb, into the rain, and toward 3 forgotten children who, within weeks, would change everything he thought he knew about power, purpose, and family. The rain had shifted from a whisper to a roar by the time Grant Whitmore stepped outside the gleaming lobby of Whitmore Holdings. The security canopy barely shielded him from the downpour, and his Italian leather shoes, worth more than most people's monthly rent, were immediately soaked by a puddle that had spread across the curb. He cursed under his breath, adjusting the collar of his overcoat. It had been a brutal day, a board meeting ambush by Claire Caldwell, his former partner turned nemesis, and the looming threat of losing control over the empire he had bled to build from nothing. His mind spun with numbers, legal clauses, and betrayal. He didn't have room for anything else. That's when he saw them. Across the street, just beyond the blur of rain and the glare of headlights, 3 small figures huddled beneath the shuttered awning of a closed deli. They looked impossibly small against the cold cityscape, wet, shivering, and eerily still. For a second, Grant almost turned away. Kids in the street weren't his business. He didn't do charity. His donations went through foundations, filtered and photographed and tax-deductible. But then the smallest boy, no older than 6 or 7, stepped forward and held up a paper cup to a passing stranger. The woman recoiled as if touched by disease, pulled her coat tighter, and walked faster into the night. Grant felt his jaw clench. Another person passed, and another, pretending not to see the cup, the eyes, the shaking hands. Manhattan could be cruel, he knew that better than anyone. But something about this, something didn't sit right. The boy turned his head, and their eyes locked. That look, it wasn't just hunger. It wasn't even desperation. It was something older than any child should carry. A haunting blend of resignation and defiance, as if the boy already knew the world didn't care but still dared to ask anyway. It hit Grant like a punch to the chest. For a man who prided himself on never hesitating, his feet were suddenly frozen in place. Then, against logic, against instinct, he stepped into traffic. A horn blared as a cab swerved to avoid him, splashing filthy water across his trousers. He barely noticed. In moments, he was across the street, standing in front of the boys. Up close, they were identical, triplets, no doubt, with matching dark hair, hollow cheeks, and rain-soaked jackets that clung to their thin frames. One had a purple bruise on his cheek that hadn't come from a simple fall. Grant's voice, always sharp and commanding in the boardroom, came out rough. "Shouldn't you boys be home?" The one with the cup looked up at him. "We need money for food, mister. We haven't eaten since yesterday." Grant blinked, stunned by the matter-of-fact tone. No begging, no whining, just a cold report of fact, like a child reading his own obituary. He glanced at their threadbare clothes, too thin for October, and the bruise now darkening under the flickering deli sign. His mouth opened, then closed again. What was he supposed to say? "Where are your parents?" he asked finally. The boys looked at each other, then down at the wet sidewalk. "Our mom's gone," the one with the bruise muttered. "And Rick, he says we can't come back until we get enough money," added the middle boy, who held the cup. Just then, a sleek black Bentley pulled up behind Grant. Richard, his longtime driver, called from the window, "Sir, your car." Grant didn't move. Rain streamed down his face and soaked through his shirt collar, but he didn't feel it. He only saw those 3 faces, scared, proud, abandoned. Every instinct screamed for him to call social services, to walk away, to protect what was left of his crumbling empire. Instead, he asked quietly, "Are you hungry now?" All 3 boys nodded. And just like that, everything began to change. Grant Whitmore stood motionless at the edge of the sidewalk, his umbrella forgotten at his side, the cold October rain soaking the shoulders of his tailored charcoal trench coat. Across the glistening street, barely shielded from the downpour by the overhang of a shuttered bakery, he saw them, 3 boys, maybe 6 or 7, huddled together like frightened animals. At first, he thought he was mistaken. But no, there they were. 3 small figures in threadbare jackets and worn sneakers, their identical dark hair plastered to pale foreheads. They clung to each other for warmth. The tallest held out a crumpled paper cup, his arm trembling as passing strangers avoided his gaze like it was contagious. Grant narrowed his eyes, heart beating faster despite his effort to remain detached. He had seen things like this before: homelessness, broken families. It was a reality he had paid to avoid. In his world, everything had a solution: a check, a contract, a deal. Not this. Not 3 starving children in the freezing rain. He turned away, jaw clenched. This wasn't his problem. "Sir, the car's ready," his driver, Marvin, called from the curb as the sleek black Mercedes rolled up. Grant didn't move. One of the boys had made eye contact. The smallest one, his eyes were too big for his face, round and shimmering, not just with water but with something heavier. Something like resignation. Or maybe, hope. Without understanding why, Grant exhaled sharply and stepped into the street. The rain slapped against his face as he crossed. His leather shoes hit a deep puddle, soaking his socks. He didn't care. He was already soaked from something deeper, something rising inside him that had nothing to do with rain. As he approached, the 3 boys pressed tighter together. The middle one flinched but didn't retreat. "Shouldn't you be home?" Grant asked, harsher than he intended. His voice wasn't built for children, it was built for boardrooms, not back alleys. The tallest boy straightened his spine, clutching the paper cup. "We need money for food, mister," he said with the quiet resolve of someone far older than his years. "We haven't eaten since yesterday." The words hit Grant harder than they should have. He looked them over again: shirts too thin for the cold, hands red from exposure, knees poking through frayed jeans. The smallest boy had a bruise blooming beneath his eye like a dark flower. "Where are your parents?" Grant demanded. The 3 looked at each other, silent. Finally, the boy in the middle, sharp-eyed, quiet, spoke. "Mom's gone. Rick says we can't come back until we bring money." "Rick?" "Our uncle." "Kinda." Grant's pulse surged. This wasn't just poverty. This was abandonment. Possibly worse. Behind him, the Mercedes idled. Marvin waited. He should call Child Protective Services, report it, wash his hands. But then the smallest boy, Jonah, sneezed violently, and instead of recoiling, he stepped closer to Grant. Not because he trusted him, but because he didn't know where else to go. And that was the moment. Not the moment he made a decision, he'd already done that. This was the moment his heart, so long shielded by layers of wealth and detachment, cracked wide open. "Are you hungry now?" he asked. All 3 heads nodded at once. Grant raised his hand. "Marvin, change of plans. We're going to Dell's Diner." The boys followed hesitantly, unsure if they were walking into another bad thing or the first good one in a very long time. As the car doors shut behind them, the warm interior swallowing their trembling forms, Grant caught his own reflection in the glass. He didn't look like himself. And for once, that didn't scare him. The clatter of plates and the soft hum of a 24-hour diner offered a strange kind of comfort as Grant Whitmore sat in a red vinyl booth across from the 3 boys he had pulled from the rain. Outside, Manhattan glistened beneath streetlights, rain pooling along the curbs like melted silver. Inside, the warmth was physical and emotional, though Grant wouldn't have admitted the second part even to himself. He watched the triplets devour their food like they hadn't eaten in days, because they hadn't. Cheeseburgers disappeared in minutes, and the fries didn't last much longer. Grant, still in his tailored charcoal suit and polished shoes, felt conspicuously out of place among the ketchup stains and crumpled napkins. Yet for once, he didn't care about appearances. Not his. Not theirs. Something about these 3 small strangers had shaken something loose in him he didn't know still existed. The waitress, an older woman with tired eyes and a gentle smile, paused by their table and gave Grant a knowing look. "Your boys are precious," she said with a warmth that startled him. Reflexively, he opened his mouth to correct her, these weren't his boys, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he nodded. "Thank you." The moment held more weight than he could understand. "So," Grant said finally, forcing casualness into his voice to mask the storm of emotion rising in his chest. "You're triplets." Mason, the one with the fading bruise on his cheek, nodded. He was clearly the leader. "Yeah." People always stare. Levi wiped ketchup off Jonah's chin with a napkin before answering. "Sometimes we try to pretend we're not brothers, but it never works. Everyone knows." "Names?" Grant asked, not out of obligation, but because he needed to know. These boys who had appeared from nowhere already felt like they belonged to some chapter in his life he hadn't written yet. "I'm Mason," said the bruised one, proud and serious. Levi, offered the middle boy, his voice calmer, more cautious. The smallest one, still chewing, raised a greasy hand in a slight wave. "Jonah," he mumbled around a mouthful of fries. Grant watched them for a long second. "How old?" "7, they chorused, then exchanged sheepish giggles as if they'd just cast a spell. It was the first truly childlike sound he'd heard from them all night. The sound hit him harder than expected. The rain intensified outside, battering the diner windows in waves. Grant checked his watch. It was nearly midnight. His penthouse, high above the city, would be dark and empty. Cold, like always. A mausoleum for a man who had traded personal happiness for corporate triumph. And yet, sitting here in a greasy booth with ketchup bottles and mismatched cutlery, surrounded by 3 hungry children, he felt more grounded than he had in years. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Where does this Rick guy live?" Mason's face went blank. Levi's mouth flattened into a line. Jonah stopped chewing. 43rd and Vine, Mason said finally, the words clipped. "3rd floor, apartment with the broken steps." Grant's jaw tightened. That neighborhood was notorious, barely safe in daylight, let alone for 3 kids left to fend for themselves. "He'll be mad we didn't bring back money," Levi whispered, eyes fixed on his now empty plate. The waitress returned with the check, placing it gently on the table. "Y'all need anything else?" "No," Grant said, glancing at the boys. "They're good." Jonah suddenly flinched as thunder rattled the windows. Without thinking, he slid closer to Grant's side. The boy's tiny frame leaned against his arm, seeking safety. Grant hesitated. Comforting children wasn't in his skill set, but then he reached over and gave Jonah's back a light pat. "It's just thunder," he said softly, "nothing to be afraid of." His phone buzzed. Claire. Probably another threat about tomorrow's board meeting. He silenced it. He looked back at the boys. "Listen," he said. "It's late, and this storm's not letting up. My house is big and warm. Would you like to stay there tonight? Just until morning." The boys exchanged one of their wordless triplet glances, a kind of silent conference Grant couldn't begin to interpret. Mason answered, cautious but curious. "You won't tell Rick?" Grant's voice was quiet but firm. "I'll handle Rick." And just like that, the path of his life veered off course. He didn't know it yet, but this night, this moment, would be the beginning of everything. The rain hadn't let up, and neither had Grant Whitmore's sense of disorientation. As the Bentley pulled into the private garage beneath his high-rise, the tension in the air felt heavy, almost surreal. The 3 boys, Mason, Levi, and Jonah, sat in stunned silence across from him, their eyes wide, their little hands clenching the worn edges of the diner napkins Grant had given them to dry off. "This is a spaceship," Jonah whispered in awe, his breath fogging the window as he peered out at the sleek underground parking bay. Grant, exhausted and still emotionally reeling, actually chuckled. It was the first genuine laugh that had escaped his lips in days. "No," he said softly. "But close enough." As the automatic doors slid open, the boys followed him like ducklings, their footsteps tentative on the polished stone floors of the luxury lobby. They had no bags. No coats. Just each other and the silent, unspoken fear of not knowing what would come next. Mrs. Langford, Grant's housekeeper of 15 years, opened the penthouse door with practiced formality. "Mr. Whitmore," she began, but stopped short when she saw the three boys standing behind him. The shock registered immediately in her sharp, British features. Her gaze flicked from Grant's rain-soaked coat to the trio of soaked, shivering children huddled behind him. "Mrs. Langford," Grant said quickly, shrugging off his coat and handing it to her. "We have guests tonight." "Guests?" Her tone was both bewildered and suspicious. "Just for tonight," he added. "It's complicated." Mrs. Langford's eyes narrowed slightly, scanning the boys. Jonah had taken refuge behind Levi's shoulder, while Mason stood protectively in front of both. She spotted the fading bruise on Mason's cheek, the threadbare sleeves, and something in her seasoned heart softened. She gave a small nod, stepping aside. The foyer's grandeur hit the boys like a tidal wave: white marble floors, a glistening chandelier, polished chrome and glass as far as the eye could see. Jonah's shoes squeaked against the tile. This is the castle from that bedtime book," he whispered in awe. "No dragons here," Grant replied with a wry smile, though his heart was pounding. Mason turned to him with solemn eyes. "Just tonight, right?" Grant hesitated, the question slicing through the air like a blade. He could have said yes. Should have said yes. But he didn't. Instead, he knelt down, level with their gaze. "You're safe here," he said simply. Upstairs, Mrs. Langford showed them to the guest wing, rooms never used, beds never slept in. She opened the linen closet and began preparing bedding without another word. When she returned with fresh towels and pajamas from her emergency stash, she found the boys sitting quietly on the edge of the bed, their backs perfectly straight, hands folded in their laps. Not one of them said a word. She noticed how Levi's eyes kept darting toward the hallway, as if afraid someone might come and snatch them away. She turned to Grant, who stood nearby, stiff and unsure, watching all of it unfold. "Did something happen, sir?" she asked quietly. "They were begging in the rain," Grant murmured. "Said they haven't eaten since yesterday. Their uncle kicked them out until they bring money home. One has a bruise." Mrs. Langford looked back at the boys and then at Grant, her voice lower. "Then I suppose this isn't a guest situation, is it?" "No," Grant admitted. "It's not." As she returned to preparing the room, Grant leaned in the doorway, watching as the boys marveled at the soft sheets, the fluffy towels, the warmth of it all. It wasn't much, not yet. But it was safe. It was warm. And for the first time in years, Grant Whitmore's cold, immaculate home held something it had never known, the tentative, flickering heartbeat of family. He didn't say it aloud. Not yet. But something deep inside him whispered, "You're not letting them go." The peaceful, almost surreal rhythm Grant Whitmore had begun building with the triplets was abruptly and violently interrupted the next morning. Sunlight poured into the penthouse kitchen as the boys sat at the island devouring pancakes that Mrs. Langford, ever efficient, ever slightly judgmental, had made from scratch. Grant stood nearby in his rumpled shirt from the night before, flipping toast in a pan, something he hadn't done in decades. Mason carefully poured syrup for Jonah, and Levi lined up their juice glasses by height. The scene was strangely domestic, oddly comforting. For a man whose mornings used to be quiet symphonies of espresso and quarterly reports, this noisy breakfast felt alive. Then the doorbell rang. Mrs. Langford appeared, her expression curious but composed. "Sir, there's a woman downstairs. Miss Claire Caldwell. She's insisting." Grant's stomach dropped. "Send her up." Seconds later, the sound of stilettos striking marble echoed down the hallway like gunshots. Claire strode into the penthouse foyer like she owned it, designer dress immaculate, lipstick sharp as her glare. Grant stepped into her path, subtly angling himself between her and the boys still seated behind him. "Missed you at the Westbrook meeting," she said coolly, eyes flicking past him toward the kitchen. The Japanese investors were less than impressed. So was the board. "This wasn't something I could reschedule," Grant said calmly, though his hands clenched by his sides. Claire's perfectly arched eyebrows lifted as she spotted Mason standing in the doorway behind him, holding a spoon of half-melted butter. "Who's that?" she asked, voice laced with condescension. Before Grant could respond, Jonah peeked out from behind his brother. "Mr. Grant, can I have more juice?" Claire turned fully to face them, her eyes narrowing. "Are you babysitting? Or is there something you haven't told the board?" "It's complicated," Grant said, voice tight. He could feel the boys watching, unsure, the tension in the room spreading like static. And then Levi emerged, hand on Jonah's shoulder. The moment Claire saw all three boys together, her expression morphed into shock, then suspicion. "Triplets," she said flatly. "How interesting." Grant instinctively stepped forward, protective now in a way he never imagined possible. "Claire," he said quietly, "we can talk about business later." "No, Grant," she said, voice dangerously low. "We talk now. The board meets in 3 hours. Your controlling interest is hanging by a thread, and you're up here playing house with 3 street kids? You look like hell." Grant's jaw tightened. "Watch your tone." Claire studied him carefully, her eyes calculating. "What game are you playing, Grant? Who are they? Foster kids? A publicity stunt? You do realize the press will tear you apart if this leaks. They're children. And they're none of your business. That's where you're wrong." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "Everything about you is the board's business now. Your absence. Your distractions. Your decline. You're giving them exactly what they need to take you out." She turned sharply on her heel, stilettos echoing once again. "I'll see you at the vote. Or maybe I won't. Either way, it's coming." And just like that, she was gone, leaving behind the scent of expensive perfume and a room full of shaken children. Grant turned to find all 3 boys staring up at him, uncertain and unnerved. Jonah clutched the juice bottle, forgotten. Levi's bottom lip trembled. "Are you in trouble because of us?" Mason asked quietly, voice small. Grant should have said yes. Because he was. His grip on Whitmore Holdings had never been weaker. But instead, something deeper rose up in him, something stronger than legacy or pride. He knelt down to their level, locking eyes with Mason. "Some things," he said gently, "are more important than boardrooms." And in that moment, for the first time in years, Grant Whitmore meant every single word. The elevator doors slid open with a quiet chime, revealing the executive floor of Whitmore Holdings. Grant Whitmore stood tall in his tailored gray suit, but there was a flicker of something uncharacteristically hesitant in his eyes. At his sides, Mason, Levi, and Jonah clung to his hands, dressed in new slacks and sweaters that still had the faint smell of department store plastic. It was a sight no one in the building had ever expected to see, the company's famously private and ruthless founder accompanied by 3 small boys. His assistant, Dana, looked up from her desk, her jaw going slack. "Mr. Whitmore, the board is waiting." Then her gaze dropped to the boys. "And they are." Grant's voice was calm but unyielding. "These are my guests. Please have Mrs. Langford meet them in my office." Dana nodded, still stunned, as whispers began to ripple down the marble hallway like wildfire catching dry brush. Grant could feel the energy shift around him, shocked glances, murmured guesses, confusion blooming behind every door he passed. Let them talk, he thought. Let them wonder. But the real storm was waiting behind the double doors of the boardroom. As he entered, Claire Caldwell, flawless in navy silk and heels that clicked like a metronome of ambition, rose from her seat. Her lips stretched into a tight smile, the kind that never reached her eyes. "Well," she drawled. "Nice of you to join us. We were beginning to think the rain had swallowed you whole." Several executives chuckled nervously. Grant remained still, composed. "Let's begin." But Claire wasn't finished. She stepped forward, a dossier in her hand, eyes glinting. "Before we do, I think it's worth addressing the unexpected additions to our office today." She looked toward the frosted glass that separated the boardroom from the hallway, just as a small, tentative voice echoed faintly through it. "Mr. Grant, can I have more juice?" It was Jonah. The youngest, barely tall enough to reach the water dispenser. The room went utterly silent. Claire's smile grew knife-sharp. "Babysitting now, Grant? Or is there something you haven't told the board?" Grant clenched his jaw. His instinct was to shield, to deflect, but not this time. "It's complicated," he said, voice steady but cool. "Complicated," she echoed, like the word had a sour taste. "You've missed meetings, disrupted investor talks, and now you're bringing children into the building? This is exactly the kind of erratic behavior I've been warning everyone about." At that moment, Mason and Levi appeared just beyond the doorway, drawn by their brother's absence. Claire's eyes narrowed as she took in the three identical faces. "Triplets," she whispered. "How fascinating." Grant moved toward the door, stepping protectively into their line of sight. "Claire, we can continue this discussion tomorrow. The boys will stay in my office under supervision." Claire's voice dropped into something venomous. "You know there's a vote in 3 hours. Your controlling interest is dangling by a thread and you're playing house with 3 street kids?" Grant stared at her, emotion tightening in his chest, but not fear. Not shame. "They're not just kids," he said quietly. "They're people. And they matter." Claire's smile vanished. "You look terrible," she snapped. "What game are you playing?" "No game," he replied. "Just life. And if you'll excuse me, I've got more important things than this room right now." He stepped out, leaving the tension crackling behind him like a live wire. Back in his office, the triplets sat on the carpet with juice boxes and toy cars borrowed from Mrs. Langford's emergency stash. Jonah looked up nervously. "Are you in trouble because of us?" Grant knelt down, meeting their wide, worried eyes. "Some things," he said, voice thick with truth, "are more important than business meetings." And in that moment, he knew, he'd never meant anything more in his life. For years, Grant Whitmore's penthouse had been a sanctuary of silence, clinical, cold, and meticulously ordered like the rest of his life. Floors gleamed, furniture sat untouched, and nothing was ever out of place. It had mirrored the man himself, structured, powerful, untouchable. But that was before 3 little boys crashed into his world like a hurricane of color and noise. Now, a week after that rainy night, the change was unmistakable. Bright blue sneakers sat by the front door, muddy and mismatched. The once sterile kitchen now bore the sticky fingerprints of Jonah and the strange sugary scent of cereal boxes shaped like dinosaurs. Someone, probably Mason, had stuck crayon drawings to the side of the refrigerator with magnets shaped like fruit. One of the throw pillows from the pristine cream couch had somehow made its way to the floor, where Levi used it as a base while constructing elaborate Lego forts. Grant stood in the doorway of his living room that morning, dressed for the office, staring at the chaos with an expression caught between wonder and disbelief. He had cancelled 3 meetings already. Important meetings. His legal advisor Sophia had warned him that Claire was beginning to fill the void, taking more calls with investors and pushing forward on initiatives they hadn't agreed on. His assistant, Jonah's namesake, texted hourly updates about how the wolves on the board were circling. But Grant hadn't left. He couldn't. He glanced at his phone, buzzing again with notifications. The boardroom was burning. But here, in this chaotic apartment full of cereal, Legos, and sticky juice spills, something else was happening. Something he hadn't expected. He was healing. Mrs. Langford, his housekeeper of over 2 decades, entered with a laundry basket filled with mismatched socks and a deep sigh. "They've turned your penthouse into a daycare," she muttered without heat, though Grant caught the faint smile behind her words. "Mr. Whitmore, this cannot be permanent." "It's not," he said too quickly. Then added, quieter, "probably not." She gave him that look, the kind that only someone who's seen you at your worst can give. "I scheduled a pediatrician appointment for Monday. Also, the bunk beds arrive this afternoon." Grant blinked. "What bunk beds?" "For the boys," she said matter-of-factly, moving past him. "You can't keep letting them sleep on the couch. Jonah talks in his sleep, by the way." Before he could respond, his phone buzzed again, this time, James, his head of security. "I've got the report on Rick Donovan," James said. 3 priors. Last year he took the boys in after their mother died. According to neighbors, he's not even their legal guardian, just her ex-boyfriend. He's been using them to beg. They come home with bruises. People have seen it. Grant's jaw clenched. "Options?" "Child services," James said. "But the system's overwhelmed. They'll likely be split up." The thought struck Grant like a blow to the chest. He turned to see the boys in the kitchen, all 3 laughing as they tried to flip pancakes with Mrs. Langford. Jonah's giggle erupted as a pancake landed half on the stove. Mason yelled something about emergency syrup. Levi balanced on a chair with perfect seriousness, supervising the whole operation like it was a board meeting. Split them up? The idea was unbearable. "Don't do anything yet," Grant said into the phone. "Keep eyes on Donovan. I need time." He ended the call and watched the boys for a moment longer. The smell of burnt batter filled the air. The kitchen looked like a bomb had gone off. "Mr. Whitmore," Jonah called, waving a sticky spatula. "We made you breakfast." Grant, CEO of Whitmore Holdings, a man feared in every boardroom from New York to Tokyo, felt his throat tighten. "I can see that," he replied, voice rougher than usual. For the first time in decades, the penthouse felt alive. Messy. Loud. Unpredictable. And absolutely full of heart. Something told him nothing in his life would ever be the same again. And for the first time, he didn't want it to be. The call came just as Grant Whitmore was finishing a conference call from his home office. Mrs. Langford's voice crackled over the intercom, tight with tension. "Sir, there's a man in the lobby. Says his name is Rick Donovan. He's demanding to see the boys. Security is holding him, but he's making threats." Grant's pulse jumped. He was on his feet before she finished speaking. "Keep the boys in the playroom. Don't let them near the front. I'll be right down." The elevator ride felt like descending into a storm. Grant had faced hostile takeovers, market crashes, legal ambushes, but nothing made his heart pound like the thought of those 3 boys being in danger. The elevator dinged. The doors slid open. There he was. Rick Donovan stood in the center of the marble-floored lobby, flanked by 2 uneasy security guards. Thin, wiry, with darting, bloodshot eyes and a smirk that reeked of entitlement. He reeked of something else, too, cheap whiskey and stale cigarettes. "You Whitmore?" Rick barked as Grant approached. "Where are my kids?" Grant stopped a few feet away, voice low, cold. "They're not your kids. And after what I've learned about you, you don't even have the right to speak their names." Rick stepped forward, fists balled. "The hell I don't. Their mom left them with me. I've got guardianship papers. Those boys are my responsibility." "No," Grant snapped. "They were your meal ticket. You force them to beg in the street. You let them go hungry, let them sleep in filth. You abuse them. Rick's sneer deepened. Yeah. Prove it, rich man. Take it to court. Meanwhile, I'll be talking to the cops. Tell them you kidnapped 3 kids from their legal guardian. Let's see what your precious board thinks when that hits the news. Billionaire Whitmore kidnaps poor man's kids. That'll play great on the front page. The threat landed like a punch to the chest. Not because of fear, but because Grant saw it for what it was, leverage. Rick had no emotional connection to those boys. They were a paycheck. A headline. An angle. Grant took a step closer, jaw tight. How much? He asked flatly. Rick blinked. What? You're not here for them. You're here for money. So how much? Rick's lips curled. Now we're talking. $500,000. Cash. You get your precious kids, I walk. Papers and all. You'd sell children? Grant whispered, the disgust in his voice barely containable. Rick shrugged. You're buying, ain't ya? Before Grant could react, his phone buzzed. A text from Sophia. Emergency board vote in 1 hour. Last chance to stop Claire. Your presence is critical. His throat went dry. The timing couldn't be worse. If he left now, Rick could try something, sneak past security, call the tabloids, even file a police report. But if he stayed, Claire would win. 20 years of work, gone in a single boardroom ambush. Grant looked Rick in the eyes, voice like steel. Security will escort you out. My attorney will contact you tomorrow. If you come near those boys again, I will personally see to it you spend the rest of your miserable life behind bars. Rick snarled, resisting as the guards took him by the arms. This ain't over, Whitmore. You hear me? I'll burn your world down. Grant didn't flinch. He pulled out his phone. Sophia's voice answered immediately. Grant, are you coming? He looked toward the elevator, toward the children waiting upstairs, the boys who now called him Dad. I'm handling something more important, he said quietly, and hung up. Back upstairs, he found the triplets building a couch cushion fort, giggling. Oblivious. Safe. Grant Whitmore, billionaire, mogul, empire builder, had just made the easiest decision of his life. He'd defend them with everything he had. And he wouldn't regret it for a second. The late afternoon light spilled through the tall windows of Grant Whitmore's study, casting golden patterns across the hardwood floor. The triplets had just finished dinner, and the house was unusually quiet, a rare break in the new rhythm of their lives. Grant sat at his desk, still in a dress shirt with rolled sleeves, sorting through the contents of a worn shoebox Jonah had handed him after dessert. It's our treasure box, Jonah had whispered, his voice barely audible. It has Mom's stuff. Inside, Grant found a handful of small, heartbreakingly humble items, a red lipstick, a silver bracelet with a cracked clasp, and a faded photograph of a young woman cradling 3 newborn infants. He stared at the picture, a strange chill creeping over him. There was something hauntingly familiar in her face, the curve of her cheekbones, the shape of her eyes. He turned it over and found no writing. Just blank space. But in his gut, Grant knew he'd seen her before. His fingers trembled as he picked up a bundle of envelopes tucked beneath the photo. One had a smudged return address. But the recipient line stopped his breath cold. To Daniel. His pulse quickened. Daniel Whitmore. His twin brother. Dead for over 8 years. Grant hadn't spoken his name aloud in years, let alone seen it written in his own brother's handwriting. He slowly opened the letter inside. The paper was thin and creased, the ink slightly faded, but the words hit like thunder. Dearest Daniel. The boys are starting to look more like you every day. They've got your laugh, your stubbornness, and your eyes. I wish you could see them. Grant's vision blurred. His hand gripped the edge of the desk as the realization crashed into him like a tidal wave. These boys, Mason, Levi, Jonah, they weren't just three random children he'd stumbled across during a rainy night. They were Daniel's children. His brother's sons. His nephews. He clutched the letter to his chest heaving with the weight of what it meant. The familiar features he'd noticed, their intense gaze, the strong brow, the slight curl in their dark hair, it wasn't coincidence. It was blood. His own blood. "Uncle Grant?" a soft voice asked from the doorway. He turned. Mason stood there, worry written across his young face. Grant swallowed hard. "Yeah, buddy? You okay? You're crying." He hadn't even realized he was. He wiped his face roughly. "I just found something, really important." Mason stepped forward. "Did you know our dad?" Grant looked at him, at all of them, and nodded slowly. "Yeah. I did. Very well." "Was he nice?" Levi asked, appearing beside his brother. "Mom always said he was funny and brave." A lump formed in Grant's throat. He was all of that. The best of us, actually. Jonah slipped into the room then, quiet as always. "If you knew him, and you're our uncle, does that mean, are we really family?" The question shattered what little composure Grant had left. He knelt, pulling all three of them close. "You're not just family. You're my family. My brother's boys. My boys, too, now." The triplets didn't say anything for a moment. But then Jonah, always the smallest and most gentle, whispered, "I knew Mom wouldn't have left us with someone who wasn't good. Maybe she was trying to find you the whole time." Grant let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Maybe she had. As the boys leaned into him, seeking warmth, safety, and something unspoken, Grant looked again at the photo of their mother. And for the first time in years, he whispered his brother's name, not in grief, but in promise. "I found them, Daniel. I found your sons. I won't lose them. Not ever." The quiet rhythm Grant Whitmore had built with the triplets was shattered on a crisp Monday morning. Jonah, usually the first one bounding down the stairs with bedhead and big ideas, couldn't even sit up. "I don't feel good," he whispered, his face pale, skin clammy with sweat. When Grant pressed a hand to his forehead, the heat coming off the boy was alarming. Mrs. Langford appeared in the doorway, already sensing something was wrong. "Should I call Dr. Harrison?" Before Grant could answer, Jonah erupted into a violent fit of coughing. Each spasm racked his tiny frame, and when the boy pulled his hand away from his mouth, there were flecks of blood on his palm. "Call an ambulance," Grant ordered, his voice tense but controlled. "Now." In minutes, the Whitmore residence turned from a calm morning into organized chaos. Paramedics moved swiftly, strapping Jonah onto a gurney while Mason and Levi stood frozen, eyes wide and wet. "We're coming too," Mason said fiercely, clutching his brother's jacket. There was no room for argument. At Mount Sinai Hospital, they were ushered into a private waiting room. The sterile walls seemed to press in tighter with every minute that passed. Grant paced, barely breathing, while the boys sat curled together on a couch, silent for once. An hour felt like eternity. When Dr. Meera Patel finally entered, her expression was grave. "Mr. Whitmore, Jonah has developed a severe case of pneumonia. But that's not all. Blood work revealed an underlying condition, aplastic anemia. His bone marrow isn't producing N." Grant's knees nearly buckled. "What does that mean?" We've started treatment, but long-term he'll likely need a bone marrow transplant. And it needs to happen soon. His immune system is dangerously weak." Grant didn't hesitate. "Take whatever you need from me." Dr. Patel offered a kind but cautious smile. It's not that simple. The donor must be a close match. Siblings are usually the best chance, especially identical ones. Grant's breath caught. They're not identical. The DNA tests, Mason, Levi, and Jonah are fraternal triplets. Then we'll test them all immediately, Dr. Patel said, already signaling for a nurse. We'll start with the brothers. While nurses gently swabbed inside the boy's cheeks, Grant's phone vibrated continuously in his jacket pocket, messages from his CFO, his lawyer, and worst of all, Claire Caldwell. Urgent, board vote moved to this afternoon. Claire consolidating votes. If you don't show, she takes full control. He ignored the texts, his gaze fixed on Jonah's hospital room through a glass wall. The boy looked impossibly small, connected to monitors, IVs snaking from his arms. His chest rose and fell slowly, each breath a fragile battle. Levi leaned into Grant's side. "We're used to being sick," he whispered. "But not like this." Grant swallowed hard. "You won't be alone this time." Later, Dr. Patel returned, her face unreadable. "Neither brother is a match," she said. "We'll expand the search to extended family and the National Registry." Grant stood. "Test me." She blinked. "You're his uncle. The odds are low." "I don't care about the odds. Just test me." As she left with the new order, Grant sat beside Jonah's bed, his hand encasing the boy's. Mason and Levi crawled onto the chairs next to him, too tired to speak. For the first time since he was a child, Grant found himself praying. Not for power. Not for profit. But for time, for grace, for one more miracle. He had sacrificed boardroom victories for bedtime stories, and now he'd risk everything else if it meant saving Jonah. Because this wasn't business. This was family. And for the first time in his life, Grant Whitmore knew exactly what that meant. The hospital room buzzed with a sterile quiet, the kind of silence that hummed with uncertainty. Grant Whitmore sat beside Jonah's hospital bed, his tailored suit rumpled, sleeves pushed up past his elbows, revealing the 4 tapes still fresh from blood testing. Just hours earlier, doctors had told him the worst: neither Mason nor Levi was a bone marrow match for their brother, and time was running out. Jonah's rare condition, aplastic anemia, had progressed quickly, leaving him pale, weak, and clinging to every breath. "Test me," Grant had said without hesitation. Dr. Patel had offered a measured look. "It's rare for an uncle to be a match, Mr. Whitmore. But we'll run the test." Now she stood in front of him again, but this time her expression had shifted, still professional, but tinged with disbelief. She held the test results in her hand like they were something sacred. "Mr. Whitmore," she began cautiously, "you're a near-perfect match for Jonah." Grant blinked. "But I'm just his uncle." Dr. Patel hesitated, glancing at the charts again. "That's the thing. The match is closer than we'd expect between uncle and nephew. Your compatibility level suggests you share almost identical DNA markers. That's virtually impossible unless..." Grant's breath caught. "Unless? Unless you and Jonah's father were identical twins," she finished gently. For a moment, time fractured around Grant. Of course. His twin brother Daniel. Gone now for nearly a decade. And these boys, Daniel's sons. Of course he'd be a match. His mind reeled as every fragmented clue from the past week snapped into place with brutal clarity. These weren't just his nephews in name. Genetically, biologically, they carried his brother's legacy, and in a very real way, they were part of him. "What does it mean for the transplant?" Grant asked, voice tight. "It means," Dr. Patel said with a hopeful smile, "we can proceed immediately. It's the best possible scenario we could have hoped for. Jonah has a real chance." Grant exhaled shakily, emotions crashing into each other like waves against rock. Relief. Fear. Gratitude. Determination. Then let's do it, he said, standing. Tell me what I need to do. Later that night, as nurses prepared the medical room, Grant sat in a gown, surrounded by antiseptic light and cold metal instruments. A nurse adjusted his fore and tried to reassure him about the side effects. It's not going to be easy, she said softly. But most donors recover quickly. Grant gave a tight smile. I'm not worried about me. In the room next door, Jonah slept with machines breathing softly beside him, his small chest rising and falling beneath a tangle of wires. Grant looked at him through the glass and felt something primal roar to life in his chest. His company was slipping through his fingers. Claire had called another emergency press conference. The media was hounding him. CPS was breathing down his neck. But none of it mattered now. Because Jonah was alive. And he had a shot. Mason and Levi curled beside Grant in the waiting area, too young to fully understand the medical complexities but old enough to sense that something profound was happening. Are you scared, Dad? Levi asked in a whisper. Grant didn't hesitate. Not at all. Because you're giving Jonah your superhero blood? Mason said, his eyes wide with awe. Grant chuckled softly, brushing back their dark hair. That's right. Superhero blood. And as the doctors wheeled him into the operating suite, Grant whispered a silent prayer, to Daniel, to the universe, to whoever had led him down that rain-soaked street weeks ago. Let this work. Let him live. He didn't care about Whitmore Holdings. Or the board votes. Or public opinion. All he cared about was that little boy in the next room. Because this time, the empire he was fighting to protect wasn't made of glass and steel, it was made of bone and blood. The hospital room was silent except for the soft beeping of machines monitoring Jonah's fragile recovery. Grant Whitmore sat beside the boy's bed, his face pale and drawn from the bone marrow donation procedure just 48 hours earlier. He looked nothing like the billionaire who once graced Forbes covers and silenced boardrooms with a glance. In this moment, he was simply a man holding the hand of a child he would give everything to protect. Outside the room, Levi and Mason sat quietly with coloring books on their laps. The hospital's pediatric wing buzzed faintly with the muted energy of children and nurses, but to Grant, the world had narrowed to the three boys who now defined his every breath. Sophia Morgan, his lawyer, appeared in the doorway. She looked exhausted, hair pulled into a loose knot, heels swapped for sneakers, but her eyes gleamed with something rare, victory. I've been trying to reach you, she said softly, stepping into the room. Your phone's been off for days. Jonah needed me, Grant replied simply, his voice hoarse. It was the only explanation that mattered. Sophia approached and handed him a thick folder. Then you'll want to hear this. The judge approved the petition. Grant blinked, not fully comprehending. The adoption, she clarified, her voice catching slightly. All three. The court has granted full legal guardianship. As of this morning, Jonah, Mason, and Levi are officially your sons. For a moment, Grant couldn't speak. His throat tightened, eyes burning as he looked down at Jonah, still pale but alive, tethered to hope and wires. He slowly turned toward the other two boys outside the glass and motioned them in with a soft smile. Mason entered first, cautious as ever. Levi followed, holding a folded paper airplane and a half-eaten granola bar. When they reached the bed, Jonah stirred slightly, eyes fluttering open at the sound of his brothers' voices. You stayed, he rasped. Grant bent down, brushing a hand gently over the boy's damp forehead. Of course I stayed, he said, voice barely above a whisper. Levi stepped closer, his eyes searching. Sophia said, the judge said, does that mean we're yours now? If that's what you want, Grant replied, barely able to keep his composure. His heart was pounding. He could handle mergers, lawsuits, takeovers, but this moment shook him more than any boardroom ever had. Jonah looked at his brothers. Mason gave the slightest nod, Levi grinned through tears, and Jonah, still weak, whispered, "Can we call you Dad now?" The word hit Grant like a blow and a bomb all at once. For years, he had been surrounded by people calling him, Sir, Mr. Whitmore, or Boss. No title had ever mattered. But this one shattered whatever walls he had left around his heart. "I would be honored," he said, voice cracking. The next moment blurred in a rush of limbs and emotion as all three boys wrapped their arms around him, their small bodies clinging tightly. Jonah's four tugged slightly, but even the nurse outside the room didn't have the heart to interrupt the moment. In that embrace, tight, messy, full of tears and laughter, Grant finally felt whole. Outside the room, Sophia stood silently, watching the unlikely family find their place. No legal document could capture what had happened here, but the signed adoption papers in her bag meant the world would now recognize what these four already knew in their hearts. They were family. Real, messy, permanent. And Grant Whitmore, once the loneliest man in Manhattan, was no longer alone. He was a father. The sun filtered gently through the windows of the brownstone, casting a warm glow across the hardwood floors, so different from the sterile, echoing silence of Grant Whitmore's old penthouse. In this new home, the air was filled with something he hadn't known he was missing for decades: life. Not just the presence of children, but the chaotic, heart-pounding, laughter-strewn unpredictability that came with being a father to three boys who were learning to feel safe. He had made the move just a week after the adoption papers were signed. Grant hadn't told anyone, not his board, not the press. He didn't owe the world an explanation. All he knew was that the 52nd floor of Whitmore Tower no longer felt like home. His sons, Mason, Levi, and Jonah, needed bedrooms with walls they could paint and space to scatter toys, build pillow forts, and hang drawings on the fridge. They needed a backyard where Jonah could chase fireflies, where Levi could read under a tree, and where Mason could climb without fear. Grant needed it too, though he hadn't admitted that, not even to himself. Their mornings now started not with ringing phones or investor briefings, but with cereal spilled on the kitchen counter and someone yelling, "Dad, Jonah flushed my action figure again." Grant had once ruled his life in 15-minute increments. Now, the days blurred with backpack zippers, missing socks, and just 5 more minutes at bedtime. And still, he had never felt more in control. But that didn't mean the world had gone quiet. Whitmore Holdings was still in recovery mode after Claire Caldwell's attempted coup. The company's stock had stabilized since Grant's reinstatement, but investor confidence was fragile. A single misstep could tank the board's faith in him again. He had reshaped the company's mission, shifting a portion of Whitmore Holdings toward ethical investments, particularly in child welfare and education. It had raised eyebrows, but it had also attracted a surprising wave of new support. He'd named it the Michael Whitmore Foundation, for his late twin brother, for the boy's father, for the man who'd never gotten the chance to raise his sons. Grant stood at the kitchen island now, watching Mason and Levi argue over who had more syrup on their pancakes while Jonah, his appetite still recovering from the bone marrow transplant, quietly arranged blueberries into the shape of a dinosaur. The sight undid him. His throat tightened, as it often did lately, not with regret, but with the overwhelming weight of gratitude and disbelief. He had almost missed this. All of this. He almost chose a boardroom over bedtime stories. Stock prices over healing bruises. A hollow title over being Dad. The front door burst open. James, now more of an uncle than a security chief, strode in with a paper bag and a grin. "I come bearing chocolate milk and extra napkins," he announced. Jonah lit up. "Uncle James," he cried, and before Grant could speak, the boy had leapt from his stool and wrapped his arms around James's waist. James winked at Grant. "This house actually feels like a home now." "You did good, boss." Grant nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving his sons. "They saved me," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone. "I didn't even know I needed saving." Outside, the neighborhood was just beginning to stir, families heading to work, kids racing to school. But inside this brownstone, a new routine had taken root. A life not measured by quarterly earnings but by laughter, recovery, and dinosaur-shaped breakfasts. For the first time in his adult life, Grant Whitmore wasn't chasing legacy. He was living it. The gymnasium of Westchester Academy was filled with chatter and the rustling of folding chairs. Parents and grandparents clustered near the front, holding phones aloft. Grant Whitmore stood at the back, leaning quietly against the wall, arms folded as he watched the school's annual Family History Day unfold. The past year had been a whirlwind, of courtrooms, hospitals, boardrooms, but today, it all narrowed to a small stage where his youngest son was waiting to speak. 9-year-old Jonah, still a bit pale from his bone marrow transplant just months earlier, stepped up to the podium. His voice was soft at first but clear, growing stronger with each word. For our family project, he began, his eyes scanning the crowd until they locked on Grant, I wanted to tell you how our family came together in a way that wasn't traditional. Grant felt his breath catch. Jonah continued. 2 years ago, my brothers and I didn't have a home. We were living with someone who wasn't very nice. We were always cold, always hungry, and we didn't know what a safe place felt like. A murmur rippled through the room. Several parents shifted uncomfortably. Grant's heart ached hearing it spoken so plainly from such a small boy. But then one night, during a really bad rainstorm, this man saw us outside and instead of walking past, he stopped. He bought us burgers and let us stay at his place just for one night. Jonah smiled, his voice gaining a note of pride. Only it turned into a lot of nights. He gave us warm beds, books, pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, even though he was really bad at cooking at first. Laughter bubbled from the audience. Grant didn't move. He was frozen, watching this brave, beautiful child tell the truth without fear. His name is Grant Whitmore. He's my dad now, Jonah said simply. He saved my life with something called a bone marrow transplant. He's not our real dad, not by blood. But he gave me part of himself to help me get better. So now I do have some of his DNA, technically. A few more chuckles followed. But mostly, Jonah added, his voice trembling now, he gave us something we never had before. A home. A family. There was silence. I think maybe our real dad, his brother, sent him to find us, Jonah said, eyes glistening. Because sometimes, the family you find is the one you were always meant to have. The room erupted into applause. Phones clicked. Tears rolled down more than a few faces. At the back, Grant clapped slowly, then rubbed his eyes with one hand as Jonah returned to his seat between Mason and Levi, who beamed at their brother like he'd just won an Oscar. Grant didn't even realize someone was standing beside him until a familiar voice spoke. You've changed, said Charles Whitfield, former chairman of the Whitmore Holdings Board. 3 years ago, you'd have walked out of that room rather than be seen at a school function. Grant smiled faintly, still staring at the stage. 3 years ago, I didn't know what I was missing. The board thought you'd lost your mind, adopting 3 kids off the street, stepping away from operations, restructuring the entire company, Whitfield said. Best insanity I've ever lived, Grant murmured. From the front row, Jonah turned back, catching his dad's eye. He grinned and waved. Grant waved back, the kind of wave that meant, I see you. I'm here. Always. And just like that, Grant Whitmore, once the coldest man on Wall Street, felt more powerful than he ever had at the helm of an empire. Because this was the empire now. 3 boys. 1 father. 1 future. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Just months earlier, Grant Whitmore had been a name that echoed through boardrooms with fear and respect. The billionaire mogul who had built an empire from the ground up was once defined by his precision, his drive, and his ice-cold detachment. But now, Every corner of his life had shifted, re-centered around three boys who had stumbled into his world on a stormy Manhattan night and turned it completely upside down. The media, at first, couldn't make sense of it. Whitmore adopts street triplets. CEO loses boardroom war to protect kids. Headlines came fast and brutal. Pundits debated his sanity. Investors bailed. The press camped outside his home. He was painted as reckless, irrational, a man unraveling at the seams. But Grant didn't care. Inside the warm brownstone on 74th Street, life was far from unraveling. It was unfolding. Jonah's recovery had been slow, but steady. Grant's mornings now began with checking medication schedules instead of stock portfolios. Mason, ever the oldest by minutes, had become a watchdog big brother, reminding Grant of his own role as Daniel's twin so long ago. Levi had blossomed under Mrs. Langford's structured care, finding joy in books, puzzles, and secretly reorganizing Grant's meticulously arranged files just to see if he'd notice. He always did. But he never scolded. And then there were the small things, things that had once seemed inconceivable. Pajama dance parties in the living room. Science fair disasters in the kitchen. Bedtime negotiations worthy of a United Nations peace treaty. The once sterile penthouse was long behind them, replaced by messy rooms filled with love, noise, and Legos. The corporate world, however, had not softened. Claire Caldwell, ousted in disgrace for her forged documents and boardroom manipulation, had attempted a comeback. She launched a rival firm, marketed as a return to business basics, aiming to poach Whitmore clients by exploiting doubts about Grant's leadership. But clients didn't leave. They stayed. Why? Because the new Whitmore Holdings wasn't just profitable, it was purposeful. Grant had rebuilt the company's mission from the inside out, introducing a division focused entirely on ethical investments in child welfare, education, and healthcare. The change wasn't just cosmetic, it was transformative. He put real capital behind it, tens of millions. Not just for the boys, but for all children like them. The story of Grant and the triplets spread beyond Wall Street. News anchors wept during features. Families donated in honor of Jonah's recovery. Adoption inquiries to state agencies spiked. The newly established Daniel Whitmore Foundation for Children became one of the fastest-growing philanthropic ventures in New York, with Grant's sons appearing at events not as poster children, but as proud ambassadors. The community that had once questioned his sanity now surrounded him with respect. The same board that once nearly removed him now applauded his long-term vision. Yet despite the accolades and recovered profits, Grant never forgot what mattered. When asked what had changed him, his answer was always the same. Everything, he'd say. And nothing. I just finally saw what was already in front of me. One Sunday morning, as he watched the boys build an epic fort out of couch cushions and dining chairs, Grant found himself smiling. He didn't step in. He didn't fix the structural flaws or offer logistical suggestions. He just watched. And listened. To the laughter. To the life. Because in the end, he hadn't just fought for those boys. He had fought for himself, and won back the kind of love, purpose, and belonging no boardroom could ever offer. He had fought for family. And it was a fight he'd choose again. Every single time. The sky over Manhattan was a soft gray canvas, brushing pale light against the city's jagged skyline as the morning slowly unfolded. In the quiet stillness of their brownstone small backyard, Grant Whitmore stood alone, a mug of coffee growing cold in his hands. The crisp spring air smelled faintly of fresh soil and rain. Today wasn't just any day. 3 years. 3 years ago, he'd stepped out of Whitmore Tower into a storm and found 3 identical boys who had nothing, no home, no food, no protection. And now, those same boys were his entire world. Behind him, the warm chatter of the kitchen filtered through the open door, laughter, cereal clinks, the occasional bickering of brothers trying to share a single spoon. Grant smiled faintly. Just 3 years ago, his mornings had been dominated by silence and shareholder briefings. Now, he measured time in toothbrushing battles and mismatched socks. "Dad," a voice called behind him. Grant turned. Ethan, always the most perceptive, had appeared in the doorway. His hair was still damp from a hurried shower, shirt half-buttoned, holding two mismatched shoes. "Do these even match?" Grant looked down. "Not even close." Ethan groaned. "Jonah stole my good pair." Grant chuckled and took the shoes. "Come on. I'll help you find them." Inside, chaos reigned in the best way. Mason was at the counter building a protein tower out of pancakes and eggs. Jonah was trying to teach their dog, Rocket, how to high-five, with little success and a lot of bacon bribes. Mrs. Langford stood at the stove with a knowing smile, flipping pancakes like a seasoned champion. 3 years ago, he had needed her for structure. Now, she stayed because she had chosen them as much as they had chosen her. James entered through the front door without knocking, a tradition now. Dressed in jeans and a hoodie rather than his old security uniform, he nodded to Grant and held up a coffee to go. "You forgot this again." "Thanks," Grant said, taking it. "How do you always know?" "You're a dad now. Predictability comes with the job." James paused, watching the boys wrestle over a pencil. 3 years today, huh? Grant nodded, emotion welling in his throat. "You called me in a panic that night," James said with a low laugh. "Swore you weren't a kid person. And then Lucas flushed a toy car and you thought your entire plumbing system was going to explode." They both laughed. The memory hit Grant in the chest like a wave, how unprepared he'd been, how afraid. And yet, how right it had felt. Every challenge, every sleepless night, every fight with CPS and the board, it had all led here. To this breakfast. This chaos. This family. "Best mistake I ever made," Grant murmured. James clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Not a mistake, Grant. Just, a new definition of success." Later that evening, after homework was done and bedtime stories had been read, Grant sat alone on the couch. He looked around the living room, crayon drawings framed on the wall, 3 backpacks dropped in a heap, a dent in the armrest from Mason's first indoor cartwheel attempt. In 3 years, his entire identity had shifted, from CEO of Whitmore Holdings to dad. From a man chasing legacy to a man living it. His phone buzzed. It was a reminder. Meeting, Whitmore Board Review, 3 years post-transition. He silenced it without hesitation. No boardroom could compete with the sound of Jonah calling from upstairs, "Dad. Can you tuck us in again?" Grant stood, heart full. "I'm coming," he called back. And in that moment, he knew, this was everything. The scent of sizzling pancakes filled the air, mingling with the soft light pouring through the kitchen windows of the Whitmore brownstone. Grant Whitmore stood at the stove, flipping dinosaur-shaped pancakes with a confidence he never imagined possessing. He glanced at the clock, 7:02 a.m. Right on time. A thundering of feet echoed down the stairs. "What's for breakfast, Dad?" Mason called out, the first to enter the kitchen with his hair sticking up in every direction. "Dinosaur pancakes," Grant replied with a grin, sliding a plate onto the kitchen island. "And yes, Jonah, they have chocolate chips." "I didn't even ask yet," Jonah said with a laugh as he climbed onto the stool beside his brother, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Levi arrived last, carrying his backpack and wearing a suspiciously serious expression. "I think I might have a math quiz today." Grant raised an eyebrow. "And you didn't tell me last night?" Levi shrugged. "Didn't want to ruin story time." Grant chuckled and tousled Levi's hair as he handed him a plate. "We'll review in the car." For a few moments, the kitchen was filled with nothing but the sound of forks clinking against plates and light-hearted banter. It was chaos, but it was his chaos. Just 3 years earlier, his mornings had started in sterile silence, an espresso shot, a calendar full of meetings, and a penthouse that echoed with emptiness. Now, the house buzzed with life. "Dad," Jonah said between bites, "you remember that night? The one with the rain?" Grant paused, the spatula still in his hand. 3 years ago today. "Yeah," Mason said softly. "You found us in the doorway. We were cold and scared. And you looked really serious." "You looked scary," Levi added, smirking. "Like a robot in a suit." Grant laughed, the sound rich and real. "Well, I was serious. I thought I had to be. Being soft didn't get you far in business." "And now you're soft and strong," Jonah said proudly, flashing a syrupy smile. The comment caught Grant off guard. He looked at his sons. Not by birth, but by every measure that counted. These boys had rewritten his purpose, shattered his well-guarded isolation, and shown him that vulnerability didn't weaken a man, it redefined him. His phone buzzed on the counter. A text from James. "Board voted to approve the Foundation's new expansion. Press wants a statement. Congrats, boss." Grant stared at it for a long moment. The Foundation, named after his brother Michael, had become the soul of Whitmore Holdings. Profits were steady, but purpose now took the lead. "Anything important?" Levi asked, noticing the phone. Grant turned it face down. "Not more important than this." A brief silence fell as the boys exchanged glances. Then Mason asked, "Do you ever miss it? The old life, before us?" Grant thought about the boardrooms, the private jets, the spotless penthouse. The power. The loneliness. "I used to think I had everything," he said slowly. "Money. Success. Control." He looked each of them in the eyes. "But I didn't have this. Family. Laughter. A reason that makes every day matter." Jonah stood and wrapped his arms around Grant's waist. "Mom would be proud we found you." A wave of emotion hit him hard. He rested his hand on Jonah's back and closed his eyes for a beat. "I think so too." Outside, the sun had fully risen, bathing their home in golden light. As they gathered their things for school, Grant felt it, deeper than success, beyond legacy. This wasn't the life he planned. It was the life he never knew he needed. As the front door opened and 3 backpacks bounced down the front steps, Grant Whitmore lingered in the entryway, heart full. He hadn't just rewritten his legacy. He'd lived his redemption. And finally, he had enough. We'd love to hear what you think. Drop a comment below and rate this story from 10 to 100. Tell us where you're watching from too. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story. And if this touched your heart, check out more uplifting videos by clicking on the end screen now.